Good morning and welcome to the Trinity Forum. My name is BJ Owens. I'm the Dean of Trinity Cathedral in Cleveland, Ohio. And I want to welcome you to our last Trinity Forum of the year. But I also want to welcome you on this day, on Pride Sunday. We are so fortunate to welcome James Alison. James Alison is a Roman Catholic priest and a theologian. He writes about sin as mechanisms of expulsion, about meeting Jesus after the trauma of annihilation, and about imagining our way towards a life free of resentment. He is known particularly as a systematic theologian and for his work on LGBTQ issues. Now, one of his core texts is Faith Beyond Resentments, Fragments Christian and Gay. He's written a lot of things, but this is primarily what we'll speak about today, as well as some of his work at the moment. In 2020, Alison started praying Eucharistically, a project exploring the ways of worshiping and Christian living in COVID lockdown. For this project, he provides the appropriate liturgical text for people celebrating at home and offers gospel readings and homilies in video format for Sundays and for the main festivities of the liturgical year. Currently, he works as a traveling preacher, lecturer, and retreat giver. He's based in Madrid, Spain. And before we meet him, I am told we may be joined by a dog named Nicholas, who is also with him at the moment. And good morning, Nicholas. And good morning, James.
Good morning. Let's hope Nicholas lets sleeping dogs lie, as they say.
We'll do that. I won't mention his name again so as to avoid that. Thank you for joining us. I'm really grateful not only for your work and your writing, but for your generosity in being with us today.
My pleasure.
I want to start actually with the Eucharist, with a little bit of some of the work you're doing now, looking at what Eucharistic practice can look like in COVID, amidst this COVID lockdown, which we hope we're coming to the end of. We all know the year that we've just had. It's been profoundly traumatic. Not only the anxiety, the fear, the loss that happens amidst a pandemic. And as a priest, you know well that it's not just people who get sick from COVID. It's all the other ways that we have been cut off from one another, cut off from life, cut off from the processes of grieving. But then into that, here in America, we've had quite a racial reckoning as we've looked at the pain of hundreds of years of systematic racism and injustice. That certainly come to the surface. And yet, we have been isolated from one another. We have been apart from not only the practice of gathering as Christians, but of the breaking the bread of Eucharist, which works in our hearts and our lives in profoundly nuanced ways that, simply put, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. But looking at that with a lot more complexity and honesty, just leaves our hearts kind of broken to be away from the table. I wonder if you could share a little bit of what your experiences have been this year, and perhaps if we might raise the question of how on this Sunday, which for Trinity is Pride Sunday, how might that actually give us a window into returning to the table in a way that perhaps we hadn't before?
That's a very complex question because it brings together both what we have been doing and what we might be doing in the future, which of course is way beyond my pay grade. But as you mentioned, what I did at the beginning of COVID, when I myself found myself in lockdown and confinement in Mexico City because I couldn't get back to Spain because Spain was in emergency at the time, was to realize that lots of people wouldn't be able to go to Mass. And so rather than go down the line of, as it were, these private celebrations that other people watch, what I wanted to do was what I think is the Emmaus model, which is the realization that actually the Eucharistic presence is domestic the word is from outside. In other words, what I encouraged people to do was to preside for themselves at the Eucharist in their own homes. And I provided the text, as it were, the missal for them, but made easy for that particular Sunday with the relevant prayers and texts and prefaces and so on, so that it was just easy to do. And I provided a recording of the reading of the Gospel and a homily on the Gospel text, as it were, so that the interpretation was from outside, but the actual act, the presence, was domestic, which seemed to me the Emmaus model. And this was really so as to encourage people at home to celebrate themselves, to celebrate the Eucharist themselves. And I'm glad to say that a fair number of people did. And what I found particularly, which was very interesting, was that women were felt far freer to do it than men. And I think it's because women are so used to having had to do things for themselves because the men won't play ball in the church, that at least in the Catholic Church, that they are really quite used to celebrating Eucharist amongst themselves, for themselves. But really, it was a fascinating experience because, really quite conservative elderly widows were very happily and delightedly and profoundly presiding at the Eucharist at their own tables and praying through the whole thing with all the prayers, which they might have just listened being rattled off if they had been at Mass, but praying them for themselves and then meditating on the Gospel. So, I was delighted and surprised at how many people took it up and found that their own practice of the Eucharist was enriched, so that what they are doing is looking forward to a time, obviously, when they can come back to presential ceremonies of the sort which I hope will be your case on Pride Sunday, in such a way that at last we can actually be together. But we will have actually learnt more about what being together means in the interval, because we'll have had ways to think through our apartness and our togetherness over this time. So I hope that that's something of what you've all gone through.
I think it very much has. Unfortunately, today, Pride Sunday, what we're doing is every other Sunday, roughly, we're outdoors and together. And on the alternating Sundays, we're indoors and we're live streaming for a little while longer. And we thought that while for Pride Sunday, it would be most ideal that we're together, we have both this conversation and a guest preacher who are doing it remotely, which meant the practicality of it has us not together. But that's not quite that doesn't feel quite right. We feel like we should be together, and we're not replacing the Eucharist with you. I'm sure you'd be the last person to want to see that happen.
Absolutely.
But rather, there's just COVID has introduced also a whole level of, frankly, practicalities that we've had to try to navigate that sometimes get in the way. What that makes me think of is actually, I don't expect you to have a deep knowledge of the Episcopal prayer book, but in the book that we started using in 1979, very much was intended to reclaim a baptismal ecclesiology, and to get us away from the idea that the cleric is doing all the heavy lifting and everybody just comes on forward and receives, but rather Eucharist happens in the midst of the whole congregation, and that the Amen that we all bring is every bit as vital as anything one woman or man who is wearing the proper robes is saying or doing, and it's very much, I think it's worked quite well. I think we've grown in that direction, and I wonder if this time apart will not help us to, if that won't supercharge that a little bit, a deeper realization that we are not passive in the Eucharist. It happens when we are there together. And I'll just say, for me as a priest, to be in a space with cameras looking at me and nobody else but Sam, who you met, recording. Of course, it's wonderful to have Sam, but to not have the gathered congregation around it does, obviously, the understatement of the century, it doesn't feel the same.
It feels deeply weird. Yes, I agree.
It feels deeply weird. Thank you for that theological term. It just feels kind of, wonky. It's wonky.
Yeah.
But let's go from that sense of the gathered congregation. This time for me has really helped me to be aware of the incompleteness of the Eucharist when the congregation is incomplete. So much of what I take from your work and from your writing gets at the DNA of why we seem to work so hard to keep our congregations from being incomplete. And I don't just mean our churches, but just the gathered body of Christ. The way that we internalize trauma through resentment, the way that we participate in mechanisms of expulsion, the way that we treat people who we view as different by annihilating them and teaching them to internalize that. And that is particularly acute for those who are LGBTQ plus. And that sense, I'll start in a place of pain, which is that of annihilation. As a straight man, that is very convicting to read that. We've all had a sense, in one sense or another, of what it means to be, I'll use in a small caps, annihilated, made to feel like they don't exist. But I'm very grateful for what you write in terms of how deeply that can be implanted for those who are LGBTQ, and how do we not only heal, but how do we move out of the place where that sense of where that shapes and distorts our sense of God, our sense of love, our sense of the ability to love and to be loved, and our sense to becoming a part of that gathered congregation around the Eucharistic table.
Yes. I mean, obviously, I've been the book to which you refer, Faith Beyond Resentment, is now 20 years old, and obviously I've been thinking quite a lot about some of those matters since, but in exactly the same line. I mean, it's organic sinking into the same reality rather than new ideas. But that's meant, at least recently, beginning to become aware of how much shame is held, not only by LGBT people, but by lots of other people, and how poorly our presentation of Christianity has enabled us to deal with that. In other words, how frequently our presentation of Christianity has served as a way of covering up shame and creating new forms of goodness over against other people, rather than allowing us to sit with shame and allow it to be held tenderly by one who occupied the place of shame and who loves us, and therefore is able to allow us to be vulnerable and delicate with each other. And that is, I think that's a real challenge for, if you like, church life. How do we understand Christ's saving self-gift such that we understand it to be present as something that detoxifies shame in practical terms in our lives? That seems to me to be. And that's, incidentally, I think that's one of the areas where I would congratulate you on being lucky to have a significant LGBTQ contingent in your congregation, because to some extent we're in involuntary vanguard in this. In other words, what we've gone through before is something that everyone finds that they're in fact going through now to some degree or another. The working through what it is to be run by shame, and beginning to become aware that what seemed like shame was something to be held tenderly, and that actually is part of what enables us to grow in mercy and vulnerability to each other. So, yes, I think that curiously the word pride can be the flip side of shame. In other words, when people refuse to accept shame, they then become proud without actually working through anything. But I think that over the years, our sense of pride has more become not pride in that bad, violent sense, but a sense of, do you know, it's actually rather good to find ourselves brought into being through experiences of and shared self-same love, and that there is a certain excellence of being human that I'm glad I've been through. That's been a privilege, and therefore can be held delicately. It's not something I need run away from or pretend doesn't exist. And having been through that enables me to be more equal-hearted to other forms of shame and marginality, vulnerability. So something like that, I hope, is at work.
Yeah. Well, that word shame, of course, is so tremendously powerful and dangerous. Another image from your work is Jonah spat out by the whale, sitting on the beach, realizing that he may have something particular to offer Nineveh, which is a very productive way. And as I read Annihilation, there is a sense of to meet Jesus, who is very much the annihilated one, who through death and resurrection has not still lives with the fact of death, and connecting. Sometimes we have to go through great pain before we can actually see that. And yet, I think there's a fine line when we talk about shame, because I wouldn't want to look backwards and say, well, shame is justified because it allows you to meet Jesus in a certain way, because shame distorts us, and in a way, I've found it. That word has such violence to it, quite frankly, that there's often a temptation to use shame as a weapon, but using more polite terms. Here in the culture wars of the United States, how often do I see the be it social media, whatever you want to say, we're very much shaming other people, who I may deeply disagree with. But does that not connect us? Does that not sort of draw us back into a place where the same brokenness that might have been used against us becomes weaponized towards other people, and that we get stuck in those same patterns?
Yeah, but no, I absolutely agree with that, which is why I think it's so important for us to understand what Jesus is doing with shame. Otherwise, it becomes, as you say, a mutually triggering device. The mutually triggering is precisely not being able to sit peacefully in the place of shame. It's precisely because I can't stay in it that I need to put someone else in it, and I can trigger them, and we trigger each other, and then you have your culture wars. And in the culture wars, only the shameless win. If there's anything that we've seen on both sides of the Atlantic, is that the principal victors in the culture wars are the shameless. And unfortunately, they're not shameless because of some superpower. They're shameless because they're such deeply damaged people that they're able to be vessels which carry other people's shame for them, and that therefore they encourage people and allow people, frankly, not to take responsibility for being human. And that's a terrifying thing, which is why I think it's so important for us precisely not to engage in shame triggering, but in what I call sitting with. And that's for me, that's something to do with the presence, the Eucharistic presence of Jesus, the presence of the Holy Spirit, allowing us not to flee from that, and therefore not producing it in other people.
I think you just drifted from the theological to the practical, because I hear in that shaming people doesn't work.
Oh no, it doesn't work. On the contrary,
if we want to,
it's simply being stuck in reactive. It's simply being stuck in the reactive, and the only way to being creative is moving beyond that. If I can say one thing, one of the dangerous things about shame and being run by shame is precisely that it takes us out of the possibility of being rationally good or bad. It actually takes us away from reasonable response. It diminishes our capacity to we act under compulsion rather than actually being able to do things that are good or bad. We can't even sin effectively when we're run by shame.
How does one sin effectively?
But well, it becomes a sin when you realize you're doing something wrong.
Ah, yes.
Because then you understand that forgiveness is available. When you notice, you can say, "Oh my God, so that's what I've been doing." That's when you can start to say, "Oh yes, now little by little I can actually become responsible and choose to do things that are right or wrong, rather than being driven." Shame drives. That's one of the things which I tried to bring out in that Jonah story. Mm-hmm. If you are run by shame, you are running away from yourself. You think that you're escaping, but it is in fact, it's the shame that's driving you and running you. So the difficulty of actually being able to become a rational actor, and I don't mean a cerebral actor, I mean one whose relational being is sufficiently peaceful that you start to be able to think clearly, assuming that it's our relational self that allows us to become thinking selves, not our thinking selves that dominate how we feel, which tends to be the model we work on. That yes, facing and allowing shame to be sifted through is absolutely vital to the possibility of peaceful, relational, and therefore rational action.
Yeah. One thing that really stood out to me in spending time with Faith Beyond Resentment, and to me, it's sort of as you mentioned, it's a 20-year-old text, and I'm certainly reading it for what endures, and not what has changed, but what have the 20 years since taught us. One of the to me very powerful ideas is moving beyond resentment means becoming aware of all the ways that our lives, our shared life, is grounded on what you call human sacrifice, which is, in whatever form we do it, cutting someone off from the sense of the community, outside the sense of what is good. And one of the keys for us is to become aware of the ways that we participate in mechanisms of expulsion. And if we were to sit here, and maybe we can do this with a whiteboard, and talk about all the ways that mechanisms of expulsion are the undercurrent of so much of our lives. I wonder if you could say just a little bit about what those mechanisms of expulsion can be and are, and how we begin to recognize. This was one of my favorite parts. I have many favorites, but one was simply by learning to see and know and map the contours of those mechanisms of expulsion and the way that we participate in them. Just knowing them starts to change the story.
Yeah, I think that's the realization that our goodness typically depends on there being some other who is not good. And therefore that our goodness is a dangerous thing. And of course, we all want to be good. So what's the narrative? What's the myth? What's the story that I'm telling about myself that enables me to be the good guy, or part of the good guys? Who is it necessary that I not be in order to be good? And who's playing that role right now? Who's the named or categorized, named individual, categorized group that needs to be the bad guy in order for me to be good? And yeah, I think that's tremendously important. Beginning to become aware. Oh my God, the people who are my necessary bad guys.
Right.
Who are they? Can I be let off? Can I be forgiven? What does it look like to begin to realize my similarity with them? rather than my sacred difference from the sacred difference that enables me to be good and them to be bad. That enables me to present myself as their victim, and therefore subtly a hero, or them as the bad guys, and therefore me as part of a heroic group who are fighting against them. Because whenever you have victim and hero stories, you're playing that game. And it's so rare nowadays to find stories where people are becoming aware of not telling yourself into, narrating yourself into acting out either a victim or a hero role.
Right. One of the things that I'm dealing with in the United States, is recognizing whiteness, recognizing the ways in which power accrues in an unjust society, and that means that when people suffer, there really is a cause for that. And when you have been annihilated, when you have suffered, when you have not had the freedom to breathe with the kind of space that God intends for you, it's really hard to not move into that dualistic place. I guess this is my confession. So you're hearing a confession, and we're advertising it for we're broadcasting it for everybody. Part of recognizing my own whiteness is about recognizing the falseness of the dualism there. And you write about resentful dualisms. It's really hard work, especially when folks have legitimately suffered and legitimately been held down to not move into that place of there are good guys and bad guys, and to internalize that, because often that really that gets us stuck, doesn't it?
Yes. Because it's not just a personal question, it is a structural, a systemic question, as I think has been brought out. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I very much agree with the notion of the hermeneutic of 1619. I think that not necessarily going into details about the New York Times Magazine project of that sort, but simply the notion of that date being a good hermeneutical starting point on both sides of the Atlantic, because it's means, if you like, it's a look at how my country of birth, and later your country of birth, enmeshed their future in a project that depended on the North Atlantic slave trade, and very shortly an immense violence with Ireland. And that these are the two, if you like, victim voices that interrupt our narrative. The slave voice more in the United States, though that it also interrupts our narrative in the United Kingdom, but the Irish narrative, even now, very strongly in the United Kingdom, it's what's screwing up. Part of the complete screw up of Brexit is the failure to remember that actually one of the most powerful indictments, and therefore questions, about the whole of the Anglo-imperial project is the Irish voice. And this is, this is a systemic part of who we have become. So listening to it, it's not a question of a huge amount of personal guilt, but it is a beginning to become aware of, oh my God, what have we been involved in, and how can we begin to make it better? But that means paying special attention to those who have in fact been telling us the truth, which we have not wanted to listen to and have wanted to put under the carpet, and have tended to think that they were being conspiratorial or mad or bitchy or whatever you like to think about it. This is not a personal matter. This is a question of having the whole structure of our self-flattering mythology upended.
Mm-hmm. And it shows us that when we really look deep at our history and we see how much our culture, our economic life was shaped around mechanisms of expulsion.
Yeah.
Human sacrifice. Can you think of a better image of human sacrifice than the slave trade? One that was an explicit agreement, and it was that was the plan. That was how they built it.
Yeah.
That's very painful. That's very painful. And as you can see around the conflict in the United States around, wait a minute, are we using that term? The name, the number 1619 suddenly has a power, as if we don't want to, because we don't want to look at it and we don't want to name it. A very powerful word that you use, one that here in America, based on what we have seen very clearly in the last year, though we know it existed and well before it continues to exist, you use the word anti-lynching. We have to become anti-lynchers. You also talk about un-Pharisee. We have to un-Pharisee, which I think you talked about a minute ago. We have to un-lynch. Or we have to become anti-lynchers, excuse me. That's a very powerful word that I'm not sure a year ago I would have heard it with the degree of clarity that I do now. And that certainly has to do with race, but it's so much more that even as we grow up, if we cast someone out from our social group because they are different, because they are queer, because they are Black, because you name it, that's a form of lynching at its earliest, pre-violence, I suppose. Is that a fair statement?
Yes. In one of the things which I think is important to understand in discussions of lynching is something which was brilliantly brought out in the book of photos, whose name I've now forgotten. But it was photos of postcards. It was a collection of the postcards sent from lynchings between about 1870 and the early 1960s from different parts of the United States. And it was put out by some people who were working on the history of lynching. It may have been called Strange Fruit, I'm not sure, but maybe that's... I can't remember the name of the book, but it was obviously a very, very well thought out showing of the evidence for lynching. But what was particularly fascinating about it was the self-righteousness of those present in the photographs. If you like, it was not only the fact that there were corpses on the trees or on the hanging posts that was set up, but the people were standing proudly in front.
Right. Look at what I did. I've seen those pictures.
So if it says to send a little souvenir to Aunt Mabel. And I think that's one of the things that we remember, that's difficult for us to remember, that while we're involved in it, we think we're doing something right. That's the awful thing. Something has already started to change when we don't think we're doing something right. And you know, that's, in a sense, what I think is going on at the moment. And that, dare I say, is part of the fear and the panic and the sense of loss as it becomes clear that something has been going on that has not been right, that can't be justified. Therefore, the justifications become ever more hysterical. So, how do we deal with our self-righteousness? That, for me, that's the... Because, as you say, but becoming un-Pharisee, becoming unlynching, it's the same thing. It's how do we begin to become aware of our self-righteousness? Because, you know, that's the violence is there.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful quote from James Baldwin, who saw this clearly, and he says, you know, it's your innocence that's the really terrible thing.
Yeah.
I denounce your innocence. It's the fact that you're able to do all this and still think you're innocent. Oh, no, not us. No, no, no.
Right. How much of this is human condition and the reality of sin? And how much of this is the historical particularities of where we are? Can we envision a world in a couple generations where this kind of lynching is no longer a part of who we are?
Idea that in a couple of generations we might be able to be over a 400-year history in this particular area seems unlikely. But what I think will happen is that things will become visible in different ways. Different things will have become unacceptable. We will have become sensitive to things. We will still be insensitive to other things. In other words, the learning process will have to continue. What I think is hugely important for us as Christians, and in some sense, as you're a clergy person, I'm a clergy person, people who are commissioned to be signs in some way, is how are we to enact the sign, which is all it can be, of the overcoming of that in our time, in our midst, in our place. I think that this is a reality that is done by sign, and that means being very conscious of the question, what is Jesus doing in our midst?
And what is one, how might the wonderful presence of LGBTQ folks in our midst help us to see Jesus in our midst as well?
Well, dear Lord, I hope that because in order to have survived in your Christian faith as an LGBT person, I hope you have become relaxed about being a sinner. And by that I mean you're able to know that you're a sinner, you're a screw-up. And the reason you're able to know it is not because someone is bullying you, but because you know you're loved. And therefore you're able to say, yes, because I'm loved, I know that I'm becoming something else, which is why I'm able to let go of my identity and recognize that I'm a sinner. For me, that's been one of the greatest privileges of exercising priesthood in the LGBT community, has been seeing how Jesus rejoices in the presence of sinners. The people who know that they're not entirely there and are happy to know that they can become more and perhaps are able to giggle at themselves on the way. That seems to me to be a very, very important part of this. One would hope that there would be a certain humour in any contribution that LGBT people bring to the party.
I certainly welcome that, and I welcome humor, offered kindly. Obviously, humor can wound, but
oh yes.
but I've always loved what John Cleese said about humor, which is when in the presence of humor, it's absolutely impossible to hold on to a system of division. You can't divide people anymore if everyone is laughing out of a sense of shared joy. And that there are a few things that can actually change our hearts, like that kind of whimsical joy, which certainly grounds me in a great many ways. It reminds me of something that you said when you were speaking to Trinity Wall Street a few years back, that it's important to avoid the trap of seriousness when we're talking about morals. These are very serious things we're talking about. We're talking about annihilation. We're talking about lynching. We're talking about returning to a sense of knowing God's grace and the presence of Christ. And yet, there's a trap of seriousness.
Yep.
What is these? Sounds to me like we should be very serious. Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, okay, so here's a good example of something which is both very serious and not serious at all. This is a quote from Quentin Crisp, which I rather love. Quentin Crisp was famously a British civil servant who was openly gay at a time when it was not really possible to be, and had all sorts of run-ins with the law. But he also had a cruel and waspish wit, and became quite a famous personality. But one of his comments was, "If at first you don't succeed, then failure may be your style," which seems to me to be a very good observation. A, because it's slightly unexpected, but B, because it brings out something that's important. Actually, to be able to relax about failure is probably necessary for any kind of success. And if you're able to relax about failure, you're able to laugh at yourself. You're able to mock yourself. And that is what, there's nothing that the devil can do with people who are able to laugh at themselves. The earnest can always be tricked into yet another self-righteous trap. Those who are able to laugh at themselves are always going to be able to escape that. And I think that that's a hugely important part of, the joy of the Holy Spirit is also being able to treat ourselves gently with humour. Not the cruelty of someone laughing at you in a put you down way, but the realization that fun can be poked because you are liked. And if you're light enough to be able to cope with that, then something really serious is going on.
God works in us through playfulness.
Yeah, I think that there's much to be said for that.
There's wonderful healing there. Well, James, Alison, I want to thank you so much for your time. Thank you for bringing us through annihilation, but to a different place, one of delight and joy, and of lightness, which doesn't deny the challenges of life, but certainly helps us to realize that Jesus is present with us in the midst of it, and healing us and transforming us and helping us to heal and transform our world. So I'm so grateful for the time to speak with you, and I welcome you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much indeed. My pleasure.
And I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us for our conversation. I hope this has been a blessed Pride Sunday for you. I hope this conversation has been meaningful. This will be our last Trinity Forum for the program year. We will return in September with forums. And so I look forward to having you join us for that as well. Blessings to each and every one of you, and thank you for watching.